may also consider workup for unintentional weight loss as well. Treatment is usually
Chapter 5.
increased atherosclerotic risk.
Heritage Land.
Factors.
The enthusiasm and determination of a given entrepreneur was only half the equation. To succeed, a business needed customers, and customers, like clothing itself, could be created. The heritage trend that revived historic apparel labels like Woolrich and Filson, and helped propel new brands like American Giant, did not arise spontaneously. It emerged from certain social and economic factors. And it was not only chronicled and debated but also to a great degree birthed and promoted by a men's style blog called A Continuous Lean, or ACL. And ACL was really just one person, Michael Williams. Williams had grown up in blue-collar Ohio, in a suburb east of Cleveland called Wickliffe. The families in his town lived in modest bungalows with well-kept lawns, and the parents worked at an injection molding plant or in machine shops, or maybe they owned those kinds of small businesses. Williams's father ran a landscaping business in the summers and in the winters plowed snow around town and sold firewood to homeowners in wealthy enclaves like Shaker Heights. When Williams turned 14, his father took him to buy his first pair of Red Wing work boots. He worked for his dad on weekends and during summer vacation. All through high school that he would do so was understood. As a kid, Williams was fascinated by the heavy industry that had made his hometown. "You see steel mills, and they're the most impressive places," he said. "I was always awed by it." But by the time he was coming up in the 80s and early 90s, the factories were closing, the city was near bankruptcy, and Cleveland had become a national punchline for late-night comedians. Like many natives of the Rust Belt, Williams developed a chip on his shoulder. He wondered why his region was in decline and why the country's leaders weren't doing anything to stop it. He knew that something in American life had gone profoundly wrong, but he had only a vague sense of the larger forces at work. And like a lot of other kids from such places, he moved away. He graduated in 2001 from Ohio University, where he'd studied retail, and just instantly moved to New York. All the jobs were in New York. "I had 10 grand from selling my car. I have $10,000 worth of time to make it." He landed a job as an assistant at a fashion PR firm, and after 6 months he moved to a bigger agency that represented Abercrombie & Fitch and Sean John, the rapper Sean Combs' label. In 2007, Williams and a colleague, Allie Paul, started their own boutique agency, Paul plus Williams. One day, he visited a factory in Chelsea called Bentley Cravats. The factory made ties for one of his new accounts, J Press, the preppy clothier founded on the Yale campus in 1902. On the ground floor was a very nice gallery selling work by blue-chip artists. Taking the elevator up several floors, however, Williams was transported to another time. The factory was a messy space with fabric scraps everywhere and rolling carts piled with finished ties. Workers stood at long cutting tables carving up the cloth that a dozen or so sewers would fashion into more ties. "It felt like I was seeing something rare that most New Yorkers don't know even exists," Williams said. Tagging along with Mark McNary, a young designer for J Press, and later Woolrich, Williams began visiting the city's other garment factories, like Primo Coat in Queens and Martin Greenfield Clothiers and Hertling USA in Brooklyn. Martin Greenfield was one of the top producers of handmade tailored suiting in America, with a client list that included Paul Newman and Michael Bloomberg. Founded in 1925 by Morris Hertling and run since the 40s by Morris's son Julian, known as Julie, Hertling USA made beautiful trousers for J Press, Paul Stewart, and other menswear labels. But nobody outside the industry had ever heard of it. These family-run factories were a holdover from the days when New York had been a leading garment center, and they reminded Williams of Ohio, rekindling his interest in the workings of industry. It was very rare to find stuff still made in the US, and I wondered, why? And, more specifically, how are the people who are still doing it? Williams wanted to champion and promote this lost breed of craftspeople. "I had all this stuff inside of me that I wanted to say and no outlet for it in my job. I was, like, I should start a blog." On Thanksgiving Day in 1985, as Americans sat down to gorge on food and football, they saw a TV commercial featuring Bob Hope and other celebrities asking them to buy clothing with the "Made in the U.S.A." label. To do so was to tell all the world America matters, America matters, America matters to you, as the jingle went. The spots were part of a new campaign by the Crafted with Pride in USA Council, a group made up of manufacturers and garment workers unions led by Roger Milliken, the chief executive of Milliken & Company, his family's South Carolina textile business. The campaign echoed one from the mid-1970s, when the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, or the ILGWU, had urged shoppers in a catchy sing-song to always look for the union label. Back then, imports were a growing problem, accounting for about 30% of the clothing Americans bought. By the mid-1980s, imports had soared to nearly 50%, and an estimated 300,000 textile and apparel jobs had been lost in the first half of the decade alone, a full-blown crisis. At the same time, the Big Three in Detroit were getting bested by Japanese car makers, and California tuna packers were losing market share to Thailand. The country was starting to see the profound effects of globalization. In a way, the Bob Hope ads were a sentimental appeal, relying on pocketbook patriotism. In marketing surveys conducted by Crafted with Pride, shoppers said they preferred products made in their homeland provided they could purchase them at comparable prices to imports. The ads, then, were a call to national unity in action. Americans should buy jeans and dresses just as they'd once planted victory gardens during World War II. But trade wars didn't feel as immediate as armed conflict to most consumers, and clothes made onshore were already getting hard to find. Taking up the challenge of the ad campaign, a reporter for the Orlando Sentinel went shopping for clothes with the "Made in the U.S.A." label. "It is a task that requires training and sophistication," he wrote, "like hunting for edible mushrooms." The campaign continued for several years and ultimately cost $85 million, with a growing number of celebrities joining the cause, but despite the genial pleadings of Sammy Davis Jr., Ted Danson, Don Johnson, Loretta Swit, Billy D. Williams, and Hope himself, Americans continued to buy foreign-made clothing by a wide margin. By 1990, imports had grown to 60% of all apparel sold, and job losses were nearing 600,000. That year, Crafted with Pride dropped the celebrities and changed its tone. Americans didn't need a gentle reminder to support their own industries and neighbors. What they really needed was to be shown, directly and starkly, the cause and effect of their spending habits. In a new ad spot, men, women, and children gathered at a pier to watch a crate of imported clothing being unloaded while a narrator gravely intoned that America was losing its apparel industry. And the worst part is, said the narrator, we're doing this to ourselves. As Dana Frank points out in Buy American, A History of Economic Nationalism, it was an American-made campaign that gave birth to the United States. The colonists who organized the Boston Tea Party were rejecting imported goods from Britain to assert economic independence. Down through the years, textiles and apparel have tended to play a central role in such movements. 9 years before the Tea Party, in 1764, a group of Boston merchants pledged to give up lace, ruffles, and other ostentatious cloth made in England, and soon many colonists, including George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, were dressing in homespun, the humble term given to cloth produced domestically. A reaction against foreign imports often arises in times of economic and social distress at home, Frank observes. In 1932, for instance, the newspaper baron William Randolph Hearst launched a Buy American campaign in an editorial in Hearst newspapers. Although he presented the idea as a solution to the Great Depression, Frank notes that he may have been motivated more by his isolationist politics. More than 250,000 people signed the accompanying pledge, and the campaign had enormous impact. The campaigns by the Ilgwu and later Crafted with Pride similarly grew out of a jittery period for workers. All over the country during the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, Frank writes, ordinary people were worried about unemployment, increased economic inequality, and the future of the United States in a rapidly globalizing economy. At some moments of economic anxiety, Americans have responded to the threat of imports with what Frank calls an import panic attack. In the summer of 1985, the Coca-Cola Company introduced a line of clothing produced mostly in Macau and Hong Kong. For textile makers in the South, where Coke was considered as life-giving as water, this was a betrayal worse than the new Coke formula the company had introduced earlier that year. I once had a dog who bit my hand when I fed him, the president of a North Carolina fabric firm wrote in a letter to the company. I got rid of the dog and we will get rid of Coca-Cola Co. in our plants if it continues to bite our hands. Some plants did yank Coke from their vending machines. The story of the protest got picked up by newspapers across the country, and the president of a bottling company with rights to the Coke franchise in the Carolinas and Southern Virginia, where 500,000 people still worked in textiles, had to step in to broker a truce. At the American Yarn Spinners Association office in Charlotte, a repentant Coke executive met an angry group of textile leaders and emerged from the meeting chastened. By the following summer, Coca-Cola clothing was being made in U.S. factories, and break rooms across the South were again stocked with Coke. A generation later, in the years after the financial crisis, Americans showed the same righteous anger when, ahead of the 2012 Summer Olympics in London, it was revealed that Ralph Lauren, the official outfitter for Team USA, had made the athletes' opening ceremony uniforms in China. For many, this outsourcing illustrated America's woeful dependence on imports. The Italians would never have their uniforms made in China, they would make them in Italy, Galina Soboleff, an LA designer, told the Los Angeles Times. Washington lawmakers especially displayed outrage, perhaps because it was an election year. Ralph Lauren had made uniforms for the 2008 and 2010 games abroad as well to no apparent concern. House Speaker John Boehner, a Republican, publicly scolded the U.S. Olympic Committee, while Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid, a Democrat, called for burning every uniform and starting over. The controversy was such a public relations disaster for Ralph Lauren that for the 2014 Winter Games in Sochi, the label promised to make all the clothes in the United States, for the athletes and Olympics retail products, which required building a supply chain practically from scratch. The company had closed its last polo menswear factory, in Massachusetts, in 1994. Actual consumer behavior is different from performative outrage, however, and Americans, broadly speaking, have proved to be fickle consumers, whatever they may say or pledge. The unbounded freedoms we cherish apparently extend to the goods we buy and the merchants we patronize. In 1771, Thomas Jefferson wrote his agent in London to request a personal shipment of some shoes and other prohibited articles, even as he touted the virtues of homespun. In my own dresser drawer, American Giant tees mingled with Hanes tees made in the Dominican Republic and American Eagle underwear from Vietnam, even as I immersed myself in the world of American-made clothes. The contradictions could reach absurd levels. I once came across a vintage rough-hewn flannel shirt with "True American Wear" written on the label and underneath it, "Made in Hong Kong." Ultimately, what got people to buy American wasn't making it patriotic, the lever was making it fashionable. Tapping into deeply held nostalgia for craftsmanship and good value surfaced what was so appealing about domestically produced goods, instead of just shaming or lecturing consumers into purchasing them. This was the chord that Michael Williams managed to strike. By amplifying the outposts of quality domestic manufacturing that remained and giving them a kind of cachet through his blog, Williams created openings not just for survivors to thrive but for new entrepreneurs to get a footing. As one ACL reader commented, "Made in the U.S.A. was the new cool." As a reminder of what had been lost and what still remained, Williams began giving his readers virtual factory tours. He'd visit a shoe workshop or denim mill, then post photos of these rare folks who were engaged in making things. He made dusty old factories seem like the most amazing places. The American list he compiled, a guide to great things still made in the U.S.A., included heritage labels like Alden Shoe Company, Pendleton Woolen Mills, and Hickey Freeman, but also a new generation of brands like Rag & Bone, Imogene plus Willie, Raleigh Denim, Buck Mason, and Stephen Allen. The founders of these companies saw the virtues of local manufacturing and, as with American Giant, had built their businesses on an old-school model of quality. At the outset, Williams didn't expect many people to read his blog, given that so few made any special effort to buy in their own backyard. But the personal, ongoing nature of a blog not only allowed him to go deeper than a magazine article in his exploration of the topic, it also allowed him to create a community around the subject. He covered menswear the way ESPN covered the NFL draft, that is, authoritatively and exhaustively. He was an enthusiastic fan and guide, and like all successful bloggers, he had a compelling point of view in his case, about what constituted good value, high quality, and responsible consumption. Williams could be prickly. He didn't hesitate to call out brands for perceived infractions. When Carhartt partnered with the designer Adam Kimball on a collection, Williams wrote critically of the company for not making any of the clothes stateside. But Williams wasn't a purist. He didn't think everything had to be made domestically. That was no longer possible. He argued that brands should give customers the option, that everything doesn't have to be imported or nothing. Williams wanted clothes to have history and meaning, rather than being meaningless throwaway purchases. He became a leading proponent of a philosophy known as, buy quality, buy once. The idea was that rather than purchase lots of cheap, disposable products, people should spend more on a few well-made items and use them for years, in effect reducing their consumption. Someone who shared this view, incidentally, was Tony Bennett. The only thing that lasts is quality suits, music, people, the singer once said in an interview. It's all the same. My suits are very expensive, but they never go out of fashion, and I can keep them for up to 2 decades. Williams's blog turned out to be the perfect meeting of medium and moment, serendipitously tapping into a deep well of feeling. His argument for timeless quality resonated with the young urban professionals and fashion addicts who made up the most devout followers of the heritage movement, as well as with older readers who remembered a time when America's factories hummed and stores sold U.S. made goods. ACL's comments section became a lively forum for debating the finer style points of crepe solace versus lug solace, but just as often, it was a place to sound off about the hypocrisy of companies that pledged allegiance to the flag but manufactured offshore. As the owner of a retail store that has sold Carhartt since 1979, I remember when it was all made in U.S.A., wrote one commenter when Williams covered a Made in the USA capsule collection released by the workwear label. Another added, now we struggle to find work clothing made in the USA, sad. Carhartt, come home. And bring the rest of the economy with you, please. Advocates of outsourcing liked to point to all the good corporate jobs that remained, even if the factories were gone. But it had been the factory that, for nearly 2 centuries, had given America its identity as a country that produced things, and no number of office jobs in New York or Palo Alto was going to restore that. Not when compared with the country's manufacturing past. Speaking to Women's Wear Daily, Williams gave voice to the sentiment that animated him, I don't want to live in a country that doesn't know how to make anything. To be sure, as the journalist Robert Armstrong pointed out in the Financial Times, the obsession with quality could be a rationale for desperate style addicts aching to justify another $800 cashmere sweater as an investment piece. And Williams was a style addict. He collected fine watches and owned Red Wings in every color. On his blog, he seemed to battle with his own material desires. He repeatedly reminded his readers and himself that you couldn't buy happiness with stuff. There were some who thought that telling people to invest in expensive things seemed impractical, if not elitist. Wasn't artisanal just another word for luxury? America's pinched working and middle classes bought cheap stuff at big box stores, not always by choice but out of economic necessity. And while General Motors and Ford did brisk business selling $60,000 pickup trucks, many Americans had evidently decided that premium American-made clothing was not something on which to spend their limited disposable income. Williams understood that person. His father was that person. He wants Carhartt to be all made in the U.S.A., doesn't want any no new.s shit in the line, he said, but then he won't buy it, because it's too expensive. But Williams truly believed that buying $300 Red Wing 875 boots made more practical sense in the long run than buying $40 boots at Walmart. The Walmart boots would be shot after a year of heavy use, whereas Red Wing has a program that let customers send their boots back to the factory to be refurbished, extending the lifespan by years. Buying domestically, he maintained, was a good economic proposition all around. You're investing in your community, and you're buying something that is probably well made. Stuff that's still made here has survived for a reason. And by the early 2010s, a new zone had opened up, a middle ground of quality at higher but not exorbitant prices. Bayard Winthrop and Gina Locklear were part of this trend. So was Todd Snyder, who during his days at J. Crew partnered with the shoemakers Red Wing and Alden, bringing handmade products to the mass retailer. Every factory I've walked through, it always hits me, this stuff is too cheap, Snyder told me. After you see the amount of labor and the number of hands that have touched it, you're like, and this only cost $300. That's why I've taken it upon myself to help tell that story. Because I think my customer likes quality and likes knowing where their stuff is made. Maybe a person living paycheck to paycheck wouldn't buy from American Giant, Stephen Allen, Buck Mason, and other labels like it, but someone with a little more means might. As his readership and influence grew, Williams found that he could help launch new businesses. He noticed a guy selling handmade leather footballs on ETSE, wrote about him, and blew up the guy's sales. The founders of Noble Denim credited his blog as an inspiration to start their apparel company. In turn, Williams wrote about the fledgling brand and others, giving them a boost. As ACL's reach expanded, Williams saw that he could use the platform to not only inspire and support new businesses but also help save established ones. J.W. Hume was a 100-year-old bag maker in St. Paul that produced canvas hunting bags for Orvis and leather goods under its own name. By 2008, the brand was on the verge of bankruptcy. Stephen Allen read the story Williams had written about J.W. Hume and began carrying the bags in his men's clothing stores. That led to a Wall Street Journal article, which caught the attention of a new investor. To fashion publicists at top labels who tried to woo him to get coverage, Williams seemed inscrutable. He ignored their gifts and event invitations and wrote about only what interested him. And what interested him was businesses like J.W. Hume, a highly specialized brand that made a single category of thing extremely well. There were many others: Tough Traveler backpacks of Schenectady, New York, Optimo hats of Chicago, Shot NYC motorcycle jackets. Many of these companies had been around for decades, unaffected by fashion trends or economic cycles, quietly plugging away in near obscurity. Williams knew he'd found a good candidate for a feature when the company's website looked like a GeoCities page from 1995. Even better if there was no e-commerce portal. It signaled to him that all the value was in the product, not in the marketing. For Williams, ACL was an extension of his marketing career. Red Wing and Buck Mason became his clients, but also a welcome break from the big personalities and high drama of the fashion world. When he contacted the factories of these small brands, many of them third and fourth generation family businesses, the owners welcomed him with open arms. I would say, tell me what you guys are doing. I just want to learn the history. They'd be like, yeah, sure, come down to the factory. It would be no bullshit, no publicist. And I'm coming from a world where you're just rude to everyone because it's fashion. One of Williams's favorite brands was the shoemaker Raincourt & Co. The state of American footwear manufacturing was even more dire than that of the clothing sector. Only 1% of shoes were still made in America, and yet Raincourt, with roots half a century old, still produced its handmade, custom leather shoes and hand-sewn moccasins in Lewiston, Maine, once a shoemaking capital. Williams had bought several pairs of the brand's loafers and mocks over the years. As he told his ACL readers, he admired that Raincourt was both a brand and a factory, with workers and families for which it was responsible. The company was run by Mike Raincourt and his son, Kyle. Williams touted the Raincourts as knowing a hell of a lot about hand sewing and shoemaking in general. On top of that, they are good people who are doing their part to continue the shoe craft in Maine. Even if you take all of that away, Raincourt makes some damn fine shoes. Curious to see the process of shoemaking up close, I called Mike Raincourt and arranged to visit his factory. Raincourt occupies half of a large, flat-roofed building surrounded by scrubland in a desolate neighborhood of Lewiston behind the city's hospital. When I arrived one November morning, Mike was in the front office area, tending to business matters. Fit and energetic for a guy in his upper 60s, with a big, square face partly obscured by a ball cap pulled low, Mike wore a fancy pair of shoes in faux alligator. It's called a captain's Oxford, he said of the style. It goes way back to the 60s. He smiled. I have a lot of shoes. A new product, I'll definitely wear it for at least a month to test it and see where the weaknesses are in the shoe, in the sole, wherever they may be. You might see me in the course of a year wear a dozen different pairs. Mike explained that he had learned shoemaking from his father, Dave, a French-Canadian who'd come to Maine in the 1940s and found work as a hand sewer in a factory in Freeport. In the mid-20th century, Maine, along with Massachusetts, was the center of shoemaking in the U.S., and practically every town, from Lewiston to Wilton to Dexter, had a shoe factory. Many of those New England shoe factories, along with the region's textile mills, were filled with French-Canadians like Dave Raincourt. Around 1 million French-speaking immigrants crossed the Canadian border in the mid-19th and early 20th centuries, and well into the 60s the common tongue in the mills and shoe factories along the Androscoggin River was French. With only a 5th-grade education, Dave rose to become a foreman and then superintendent at another factory. When the owner retired in 1967, he bought the business. 50 years later, Mike could still remember sitting around the kitchen table with his father and his buddies the day Dave became a business owner. They opened up a bottle of champagne. They gave me a little sip of it. They were all smiles, Mike said. Everybody was cheering that my dad had just bought a factory. I was 14. The other childhood memory of his father is a sensory one. What sticks with me today, Mike said, is the smells and odors of a shoe factory. You have leather and you have glue and you have threads and oils. That's really what struck me the most as a young person, the smells that my dad would bring home with him, on his clothes and hands, from work. Dave's business specialized in hand sewing uppers, the sections of the shoe that cover the foot above the sole, as well as hand sewing moccasins. After several years, he sold the upper making factory to Quaddy, and in 1982, he approached Mike with the idea of starting their own company. Mike was 28 at the time and working in the restaurant business. He saw shoemaking as akin to cooking. You're taking raw materials, and you're turning it into something people love. The timing couldn't have been worse. The year before, the Reagan administration had lifted shoe import quotas, and cheap footwear, mainly from Taiwan, was flooding the U.S. market. But in the stubborn, gutsy way of the kinds of apparel manufacturers that caught Williams's attention, Mike saw opportunity. With companies slashing costs and closing factories to stay competitive, there was a space in the market for higher-end footwear, which was labor-intensive. Mike and his father set up a factory in the old Lewiston Bleachery and Dye Works building downtown and started making hand-sewn shoes for Cole Haan, a brand that put a premium on the beauty of a shoe, the assembly, and finish of the leathers. Mike took the approach to heart: make sure you are always on the premium side. Never dip your toe in the mass-produced, volume business. After Dave retired in 1991, Mike and his wife, Debbie, started another manufacturing company, Maine Shoe. Their biggest customer was the Wisconsin-based dress shoe brand Allen Edmonds, which hired Mike to make hand-sewn footwear, by then a dying craft hardly practiced anymore outside New England. In 1998, Mike and Debbie sold the business to Allen Edmonds, and Mike stayed on as president in charge of manufacturing in Lewiston. Raincourt's financial security while preserving the local tradition of shoemaking. But a private equity firm bought Allen Edmonds in 2006, and during the forthcoming recession, the new owners decided to close the Maine operation completely and move a majority of its production to the Dominican Republic. Mike learned of the plan at a board meeting. He didn't react on the spot. He tried to understand the company's position even as he was absorbing the blow. It was like a dagger in me, he said, because it was my community. Mike declined a new role within the company. Instead, he made the CEO an offer. He asked to buy his factory back. Just as his father had done, Mike invited his own son, Kyle, to join him in the business. Kyle had been preparing to go to graduate school in film, imagining a career for himself teaching film studies. But he saw his father's passion and excitement, and he respected what his grandfather had built. Together, Mike and Kyle reimagined the family business. Even as Raincourt remained a private label manufacturer for other brands Timberland, Sperry, Red Wing, Ralph Lauren, making shoes for the Olympic athletes, Mike and Kyle began to design and make their own line of custom leather shoes. These they sold online, direct from the factory, to save on distribution costs. They were the shoes that Michael Williams got so excited about. Out in the parking lot, Mike's truck bore the license plate shoe too, and as he led me out to the factory floor, he had the contented air of someone who does what he loves every day. Still, when I opened the factory door from the office, it strikes me, he said, of the smells of leather and oils and glue. Most of the employees were in their 50s or 60s, working-class rural white folks who'd spent their lives laboring in Maine's shoe factories, at G.H. Base in Wilton or Livermore Falls Shoe in Livermore Falls or at L.L. Bean, which still manufactured its famous bean boots in Brunswick. Some had come to work for Mike and his dad back in the 1980s and stayed through all the changes. But refugees from Angola and Congo had settled in the Lewiston area in recent years, and about a dozen of the new arrivals now worked for Raincourt, bringing new energy to the aging factory. Mamie Cobulo had been orphaned in Congo at 16 and later fled amid the country's political upheaval, eventually joining a sister in Maine. She'd been a seamstress in Congo and got a job in Raincourt's sewing department, running a pneumatic sewing machine and stitching uppers. The vibrantly colorful traditional African dresses Mamie wore made her stand out on the factory floor. "This is the first place where I've stitched leather," she said. "The material is different and challenging. Clothes are easy. But for shoes, you have to be focused." As he walked among the machinery and workers, Mike said he tried to source as many components as he could in America. The leather hides, for example, came from the Horween tannery in Chicago. At Horween, Mike dealt with a guy about his age named Skip. His dad had dealt with Skip's dad. The thread was from a Lewiston company, Maine Thread, while the heels were made in Brockton, Massachusetts, by Montello Heel. Producing one pair of shoes took about 130 separate steps. Raincourt made penny loafers, boat shoes, wingtip brogues, dress boots, chukkas, and even a sneaker that Kyle had designed. But the brand was most famous for hand-sewn mocks. Experienced hand sewers earned $20 an hour at Raincourt. The job hadn't changed at all from the days when Mike's father started doing it, and the trade had typically been passed down from older to younger workers, but the transmission didn't always take. "We've attempted to train a dozen or so people in the last 10 years, Mike said, taking me over to the department, and none of them have succeeded at it." Another upstart shoemaker in Lewiston relied on an 87-year-old hand sewer. Indeed, Raincourt's 5 hand sewers were some of the last Americans doing it full-time. For the next hour, I perched in that corner of the factory, watching the practitioners of a nearly lost craft. A hand sewer stands at a workbench. Laid out on the bench are the tools of the trade: a knife, an awl, thread, tacks, lasting pliers, a curious tool with the jaws of pliers and the head of a hammer, needles, wax, and a small, rounded piece of wood that is used for rubbing out marks and nicks in the leather. The needles are thicker and longer than standard sewing needles and have rounded tips. A good hand sewer can produce about 20 pairs of shoes a day, depending on the style. That November day, 2 sewers were off deer hunting, and another was out sick, leaving Jewel Rowe, the only woman in the department, and Jeff Rodrigue. Jewel's gray hair was pulled up, and she wore a blue work apron. She was friendly but terse, saying only that she'd been sewing for a long time and was, at 60, 2 years from the age at which she'd told her husband she would retire. Jeff looked about 50, with light brown hair, a neatly kept beard, and glasses. He wore a black shirt decorated with car racing patches. He had a Yankee reserve as well but soon warmed up. It was the Monday after the race for president had been called. "Had a good weekend," Jeff said, smiling. "The idiot Trump lost and I got a nice dough on Friday and took it to the butcher." Early in his career, Jeff had worked for L.L. Bean, though his time with the Raincourts dated far enough back that he remembered Mike's dad. The shoe trade ran in Jeff's family. His father had been a hand sewer, too. He'd just returned from his lunch break, and I watched him prepare for getting back to work. He wound white athletic tape around his fingers, much like a pro football linebacker gearing up for a game. The tape helped reduce calluses and guarded against slicing a finger when he yanked the waxed nylon thread tight. Jeff was working on an order of bison leather slippers. The process of making these shoes, derived from Native American methods that had been used for hundreds of years, involved only human hands, simple tools, and consummate skill. To set up the slipper for sewing, Jeff grabbed a pre-cut piece of leather and pulled it over a plastic shoe form, known as a last, using the lasting pliers. This would be the shoe bottom. He then hammered tacks into the leather to hold it in place. He repeated this action with the top piece of leather, pulling and tacking so that the 2 pieces, top and bottom, were properly aligned on the last. If he didn't get them lined up right, the shoe would come out crooked when it was sewn. There was no guide, it was all done by eye and feel, as every leather reacts differently to the environment. Next, Jeff secured the last in a bench vise to steady it for sewing. Holding 2 threaded needles, one in each hand, and the awl as well, he carefully pierced a hole into the leather with the awl. Then he stuck the needles through the hole, going in opposite directions, and pulled the thread tight in a flourish to make a stitch. He raised his arms out and away from his body after each stitch. His hands and arms moved quickly, fluidly, confidently, even though the job is physically taxing and one mistake can ruin the expensive leather. It was like watching a kind of ballet. Jeff repeated the motion all the way around the shoe. The wooden rub stick had a grooved edge on one end, a channel cut into it that helped close the shoe. Jeff rubbed a little wax on the edges of the leather and ran the stick quickly around the seam, pushing the joined pieces of leather together until the 2 parts were seamlessly one. "Takes a good 1 year to learn to do it," Jeff said, yanking the last stitch tight and loosening the shoe from the vise, ready to begin its mate. He'd been doing it now for 30 years. In a letter to his readers that he titled, Heritage Land, Michael Williams once explained why he sought out and supported businesses like Raincourt & Co. and, in effect, workers like Jeff. "Why would I buy leather shoes from some random DTC company," he wrote, meaning an upstart direct-to-consumer online retailer, "when I could buy from Crockett & Jones or Red Wing, which have both been around for over 100 years and are still owned by families. Part of the reason I have focused so much of my attention on these types of businesses over the years is because I want them to continue to exist." No text can be read aloud.